Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt. How are you in southern DMZ today?
Good to see you. I'm back from sunny Florida, tanned and rested. Good to be back.
Now, is Florida your typical winter vacation of choice?
I like anything warm weather. I spend a lot of time in Scottsdale, and I love San Diego. But in this instance, I was in Palm Beach and could not be happier. Beautiful, sunny, 70-plus degree weather. Although I will say this, going to Palm Beach with two kids under the age of 3 is a different experience.
That just doesn't sound like a vacation. I have not made the plunge and done a real vacation since we had the two kids. That just seems like I'm paying a lot of money to suffer the same stress that I do at home.
Yeah, it's different, but trust me, man, I'm glad that we did it. And I feel I'm so much happier. I think that our viewers, I even saw some comments in the comments section that I was lethargic, and I hope that this week I bring my A game back to the DMZ.
Well, you'd be in time to bring your A game in time for CPAC, which is the conservative party of the year. I think I just saw a National Journal that probably took a big hookup scene. I didn't know that. Not that you run that way these days.
Well, we always bring up every time we talk about CPAC, though, you have to go back to the Stephen Glass fabulous accounts of CPAC and portrayed in Shattered Glass, a terrific little movie. But obviously he was the New Republic writer who made up tales about getting tails at CPAC. Let me say that, just anecdotally speaking, that, although everything Stephen Glass wrote was apparently invented about CPAC, it seems like that if you were single, there's a ton of young people who go there. I'm sure that there's some partying that takes place after hours at CPAC. Now, I'll be tucked in my bed around 7 p.m., so I will miss all of this, but I'm sure that it happens.
But it seems like, the conservative movement still sort of feeling its way post-election. The Chris Christie has been snubbed. The big stars are being elevated now are Trump and Palin. It doesn't seem like they are taking the establishment concern that the party needs to recalibrate its image to be more appealing to the middle.
Well, I think that a few weeks ago, there was a lot of dissension about CPAC, and the tipping point might have actually been when they invited Donald Trump to speak, because that really undermined all the other arguments. They said, we're not going to have this group Go Proud co-sponsor. Well, it turns out they had invited Donald Trump the first time he ever spoke at CPAC, so that was odd. They said that Chris Christie didn't have a future in the Republican Party, but of course, Donald Trump is speaking. They didn't. There was this woman. I'm trying to think of her name now. She blogs at Atlas Shrugs.
Pamela Geller.
Pamela Geller. They didn't invite her to CPAC, and I wrote, well, hey, she's a birther. Maybe it's a smart move not to invite her at CPAC. They took some guff from that. Well, now they invite Donald Trump, the birther among birthers. And so having Trump
Geller was there first. Trump was sort of piggybacking on the Geller bandwagon there, I think.
Yeah, maybe she staked out that terrain before him, but he was the most prominent birther, I think.
Yes, the popularizer.
So in any event,
the Elvis Presley of birthers.
But I feel like things have settled down a little bit and gotten better for CPAC, and I suspect that look, you can't get past the fact that there are going to be some big speeches delivered by people like Marco Rubio and Bobby Jindal and I think Paul Ryan and Ted Cruz, and so you can talk all you want about Palin and Christie getting snubbed, Palin speaking. But there's going to be news to be made there.
And I think that, we talked about Rand's prospects in 2016 a few weeks ago before the big filibuster, based on the way he was staking out the farthest right ground on a balanced budget timeline, and how that was seemed to be stoking some favorable response from the base in a way that Rubio's immigration politicking has not, and now after this filibuster, which seemed to actually pull the entire party towards the more isolationist stance of the Paul movement in a seemingly very rapid fashion to McCain and Lindsey Graham's dismay. Coming off the heels of that moment, a big speech at CPAC and a straw poll win might really elevate his stock in 2016 circles.
It could, Bill. It's interesting because the filibuster specifically dealt with a very narrow potential thing, which would be a president using drones to kill Americans in America. And it's hard to be against that. I mean, but I think clearly the more neocon wing of the conservative movement views this popularity of Rand Paul much broader than that, almost as an existential threat. And we've seen Bill Kristol say that he's part of the Code Pink wing of the party. People like Michael Gerson have spoken out against him. And the response from Lindsey Graham and John McCain seems to be really overwrought if you consider all Rand Paul was doing was talking about this very limited potential civil liberties issue. But clearly they view Rand Paul as being someone who could inspire young people and really change the party. Connor Friedersdorf wrote about this, quoting heavily from Rush Limbaugh, that Rush Limbaugh seems to be kind of jumping on the Rand Paul bandwagon. Bill, I remember as a child of the 90s, or at least a college student of the 90s, it was very fun to be a conservative back then because, you know, you could just oppose Bill Clinton. It was rebellious, revolutionary. He was the man. We were against intervention and all this stuff. And I think that Rand Paul can tap into that same kind of millennial zeitgeist, but also do it in a way that's much more appealing to the mainstream than Ron Paul could. So, look, I don't know.
Well,
it seems like something's afoot.
That's why I think McCain and Graham, from their perspective, are not being overwrought because they're not looking. You know, Rand Paul was taking essentially the easiest argument in the isolationist spectrum. You shouldn't kill Americans on American soil with a military drone. That's the easy argument, and using that as a gateway into the broader philosophy, the foreign policy philosophy of the Paul libertarian movement. I mean, that's what Graham and McCain are worried about.
Right. Well, Rand Paul may be a gateway drug. In the same way that Ayn Rand is a gateway drug into conservatism. And I guess you have to worry, is he going to be a gateway drug that leads the conservative movement astray? Or is he going to be some figure that inspires young people to get involved in the Republican Party and libertarianism and then maybe change as they grow older into a different brand? I mean, I've become, someone described me on Twitter as a Burkitarian or something. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I certainly have libertarian leanings, but I used to be more libertarian, and I think I've, maybe become less libertarian as I've gotten older. And I think that's probably quite a common evolution.
A conservative is a libertarian that got mugged, right?
Well, it's interesting. I'm thinking about writing about this. The saying. I was watching. There was a good Blogging Heads that I was watching. I'm trying to think of who it was. The guy who wrote, John Ronson, who wrote the book Them and Men Who Stare at Goats, did a Blogging Heads about a month or two ago. And the conversation, they were talking about this phenomenon, or the quote, I think that's attributed maybe falsely to Churchill, about any young man who's not a liberal has no heart. Any old man who's not a conservative has no brain. There's some truth to that, but as they point out, not always the case as well. I mean, but your point really that Rand Paul maybe
striking a chord with younger voters. I'm curious, how deliberate and calculated do you think that is? I know there's a lot of angst in Republican circles that Republicans are losing an entire generation of voters, that this 18 to 34 cohort, they're having their brand loyalties be determined now, and if they see the Republicans as just out to lunch, then no matter what economic ups and downs occur over the next 40 years, they just won't take Republicans seriously. Do you think Paul and others are consciously saying, you know what, we have to get back in with these people. Here's our entry.
Yeah.
Let's sort of this easy argument and see if we can then pull them over and take the rest of the buffet.
Well, in the case of Rand Paul, I think he's incredibly sincere. I don't think he's changed. I mean, his position on drones and civil liberties, I think, would be the same if there were a Republican president or a Democratic president. But I think other Republicans who are sort of latching onto this in a more opportunistic manner are partly doing it because they see that the winds are blowing a certain direction, and maybe out of necessity. Rand Paul has I have seen prominent conservatives shifting on social issues lately, essentially doing what Mitch Daniels got attacked for saying when he talked about declaring a truce on social issues. I've seen prominent conservatives lately essentially espouse the argument that we should quit fighting for social issues, that let the states deal with that. Rand Paul today and Policy Mike, the website Policy Mike, did an interview, outreach specifically targeted toward millennials, where he makes the case that some issues, he doesn't say which, but some social conservative issues should be taken off the national debate plate and should be decided amongst the states. That's part of, I think, the rebranding. I just posted a post right before we did this bill about a new group launching of young conservatives in favor of same-sex marriage. People like S.E. Cupp, Will Cain, and the Huntsman daughters, Meghan McCain, several, kind of prominent young center-right opinion leaders who are jumping on that bandwagon. I will say this, Bill, from my personal standpoint, I understand that libertarian argument. I see the right to life cause as analogous to the abolitionist movement. And to me, it's a cop-out if we get around to saying that's a state's issue. To me, returning it to pre-Roe versus Wade days, I would see as a betrayal and a cop-out. On other social issues, I suspect a lot of conservatives would be more than happy to say, let's let the states sort it out and be federalist in that regard. But I think that's one of the things that's happening. And by the way, Rush Limbaugh, as Connor Friedersdorf pointed out, seems to be jumping on the Rand Paul bandwagon and sort of throwing Graham and McCain under the bus, and that's quite telling.
Now, when I was at CPAC in 2007, great way to spend a little vacation, by the way. It wouldn't matter where you come from politically. It's a good time had by all.
I'd go to Florida instead, given the choice. Given the choice, Bill. You don't want to go to CPAC.
I mean, there were a handful of mantras when I was there that just seemed like beaten into your brain repeatedly, and I get the sense that happens every year, that they seem to be sort of like playing the greatest hits when you go to these things. And one was that the conservative movement, the Republican Party, stands on three legs of the stool: fiscal conservatism, social conservatism, and national security conservatism. And now it seems like you have, as you said, some people questioning the social conservative part of it. I was that mantra was sort of designed to beat back the social moderates, because those the social conservatives are the ones that are sort of easiest to leave behind. But now it seems like they're taking a whack at the national security conservatives. If everyone from Mitch McConnell to Rush Limbaugh is embracing the Rand Paul filibuster here, and it's only McCain and Graham and maybe Kelly Ayotte who are pushing back on it, what does that say about the premise of the conservative movement for the last 30 years? I mean, isn't there a big risk here that the Republican Party is about to throw away a national security advantage that they've held for decades and kept them in charge at many times when lots of other things like the economy, inequality, social issues were not going their way. You at least know if you want to go drop a bomb on somebody, you're going to vote Republican. They're going to keep you safe. Is there a risk that's going to get thrown under the bus here?
Absolutely. I think there's an incredible challenge facing the conservative movement in terms of what does it stand for. I mean, I've been talking about this for years now, this soul searching that they're going through. And it's not just a matter of words and rhetoric. I mean, this is a legitimate identity crisis. Parties change, movements change. And the Republican Party used to be an isolationist party, going back to World War II. You got the old right, which now finds itself holed up at the American Conservative magazine, the Pat Buchanan wing, which for decades was on the outs. All of a sudden now seems to be, back in with Rand Paul. And so parties change, movements evolve. They evolve to fit the times. I mean, the Cold War has been over for a long time. I think there was a hope that the glue that would hold the modern conservative movement together would be opposition to, would be fighting the global war on terror. That it would become like the new Cold War. Not that anybody's rooting for bad things to happen, but it happened, and that would be the glue that held these disparate factions together. But I think, Barack Obama masterfully has sort of taken the foreign policy issue off the table and really for the first time in a generation or two made the Democratic Party acceptable in terms of being a party of strong national defense and foreign policy. Now, that could fall apart, but I think he has contributed to this. So I think there's a lot of soul searching, and there's going to be a fight over the heart and soul of the conservative movement. I don't know if right now what's happening with Rand Paul could be a fad. But, look, I mean, you have Marco Rubio, who is a rising star, who's very much kind of a Kennedy-esque, Bernie Burden, pay any price. America has to be a shining beacon of hope. And then you have someone like Rand Paul, who is talking about a much more modest foreign policy. So that could be, we could literally see this Cold War, so to speak, taking place as in the form of surrogates. Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, this could be a microcosm, literally going head-to-head, a microcosm of this larger battle for the conservative movement. I'm
going to shift gears shift to different topics. You mentioned Obama and how he is forcing these recalibrations within the Republican Party. This is also a week that we're seeing a souped-up Obama charm offensive. Dinner with 12 Republican senators, meeting with the full House and Senate Republican caucuses this week. An extra emphasis on trying to forge some sort of grand bargain where they swap Social Security and Medicare changes for higher tax revenue through closing loopholes. You have long criticized Obama for sort of not leading in this way, for missing his moment to truly change the tone, be bipartisan. Do you feel like he's come around to your way of thinking, and he's doing what you want to see him do, or are you siding with some of the Republicans saying this is just for show, we don't take him seriously, we don't think he's really willing to break pre-orthodoxy and meet us halfway?
Well, I hope it's sincere. It's still early. I don't know. Everything I know about Obama so far is that when push comes to shove, he plays politics. He becomes partisan. He doesn't want to work across the aisle. I hope that is changing. And there's an argument to be made that it's in his best interest to change. It could be, this may sound Pollyanna, but I really do believe that he may ultimately be judged by his failure to address, entitlement reform, which could threaten liberal policies, and not to mention that, there is pressure being put on the White House right now because rather than tackling entitlements, they've had to tackle so-called discretionary spending, cancel those White House tours. So I would love nothing more than for him to work across the aisle with Republicans. It is funny, though. You have to feel sorry for those Republicans who had dinner with Obama, because the timing happened just as Rand Paul was launching this filibuster. And so the juxtaposition couldn't have been worse for those Republicans trying to build bridges. But having said that, I think it's too early to say whether or not this is a serious effort or window dressing. I really do hope that it's a sincere effort, because we really do have to address entitlement reform, and I think we need tax reform too, and that cannot happen with one party. Not when we have divided government. So they have to work together.
Now Obama is saying essentially, I will do both. I will do tax reform and entitlement reform. You have to lean on your party to accept tax reform that has net revenue, and I'll lean on my party to accept effective benefit cuts and Social Security. Maybe it's not so much Medicare. I think Medicare talks about benefit cuts for the wealthy. And with Social Security, it's about changing the cost of living formula that would change benefits relative to projections over time. If you think Republicans said, okay, you're willing to do that, we're willing to do that, Obama would pull the football away? Or do you think that Obama's offer is not serious from the get-go?
I don't know. It's entirely possible that, clearly the thing he has to say is, I want to work with everyone. I want to work, that's what you say, whether you mean it or not. So it's possible that it's just something he's saying. It's possible that other actors could intervene and mess it up. We've seen that happen before. It could be Harry Reid, for example, or others who mess it up. It could be Republicans. I think that, obviously Republicans are very hesitant for any more taxes. They've already essentially voted to raise taxes with the whole, January 1st, when the Bush tax cuts expired for people making over $250,000. And so Republicans were complicit in that, whether they want to be or not. And of course, that revenue is included in Paul Ryan's budget. But I think that fixing entitlements trumps everything else. And I think that, not necessarily just to me, but I think to Republicans. So I think that if there was really a sincere effort to fix, Social Security, Medicare, these entitlements, which honestly are where most of the money is, along with national defense in the budget, I think you'd see Republicans actually go along with it if there was a bold effort to actually fix the entitlements.
This is what I'm less so sure about. I don't believe that Obama would pull the football away. I don't think you make an offer that you're not going to stand by. He's made this offer now a bazillion times, so I have to think that he means what he says. But I am more unsure on both sides how urgent they feel this is. To what extent is entitlement reform that crucial to be done now? Obama gave an interview to ABC and Stephanopoulos yesterday where he says, look, the debt is essentially stabilized, so we're not in a crisis. If we don't do this deal, it'll be a missed opportunity. He still wants to do it. But he suggested that if he doesn't do it, it's not like the entire house of cards falls apart and we become Greece. So that seems to suggest, look, I put the offer out there. They don't take it, they don't take it. And on the Republican side, I think there was some suggestion, I think it was in a National Journal piece, that, as you said, they already think they raised taxes once, so they don't necessarily want to do it a second time and really risk ire from their base. Although I kind of feel like you can't be a little bit pregnant. You already crossed that Rubicon. See, what's the difference if you do it once or twice? But
they had the semantic benefit, though, of not technically voting for a tax increase.
But no one buys that. Everyone says they raise taxes. But it does seem to be their stance on it. This is what they're saying, and it raises the question: how badly do Republicans really want to go into their districts and say, we've cut Social Security and Medicare. They've often run, they were trying to attack Obama for saying, you cut Medicare. They haven't run saying, we want to cut Medicare. So if both sides don't really want to do it, I think Obama would do it if Republicans came along to, as he has outlined, the bargain. But I also think that Obama is trying to push this issue aside for several months, so his agenda on immigration and guns and infrastructure and minimum wage doesn't get completely chewed up by constant budget politicking. I think that's why they're not going headlong into government shutdown in 2 weeks. If you did that, that probably locks you into a budget battle for the rest of the year. And this way, Obama can say, okay, we're not at a crisis point. We've got a good chunk of deficit reduction taken care of. Maybe not in the way I ideally wanted, but between the tax increases, which I liked, and the spending cuts, which I don't really like, it's still a good net deficit reduction. It puts us off of the crisis path. Let's focus on other things right now. I got this other offer out here for you guys to take if you want it. I'm willing to meet with you lots to try to get that done. But if you don't want to meet me halfway, whatevs. That's kind of where I see it happening right now.
You may be right. I think that it would be terrific for Obama's legacy if he were able to, having pushed through Obamacare in very partisan fashion, if he could also get some sort of a grand bargain to fix something that almost universally is agreed is a fundamental and systemic problem that needs to be addressed by grown-ups, that would burnish his legacy and his reputation. But I don't know if he will go that route or not.
I mean, I don't want to spend too much more on this. I know you want to talk about the state of conservative media before we go, but my sense is that he probably thinks that immigration and probably infrastructure, having some tangible, concrete achievements like high-speed rail, for example, I bet he sees those as more legacy-type achievements that people talk about for decades. Budget deals tend not to be talked about for decades. They tend not to be glorious things that we read about in textbooks. So that's more kind of basic maintenance. That's that's not huge, exciting stuff. So my guess is he's okay. I mean, I don't think he wants to miss the opportunity, but I don't think he wants to necessarily break his back over it and really make more concessions that Democrats will willing to stomach. But I know you want to talk about state of conservative media. I know that there's a sense that the traditional media is really attacking conservative media for not living up to the promise, not being factually based. And I don't want to put you on the spot about Daily Caller stuff. That's not really DMZ style. I don't need to. And if we have a whole thing about Daily Caller, I think that sort of puts us down a less interesting path. I just want to get your take on the broader argument. Is this a fair shot? Does conservative media have to do a better job to be seen as credible and therefore to be more influential? Is it sort of their interest to step it up, or are people just taking unfair pot shots at conservatives?
I think all of the above. I've given this a bit of thought. First, I think that it's important to note that conservative journalism is sort of in its infancy. Now, for a long time, we've had great opinion writers and outlets who do opinion. But, aside from Bob Novak, traditionally conservative media has been very opinion heavy and not heavy on original reporting. And there are obviously exceptions and very good conservative journalists out there. I do not want them to feel slighted. But I would say just generally speaking, and I think that outlets like the Daily Caller and Breitbart have upset the apple cart in the sense that I think as long as you sort of comment on the media narrative, like what the mainstream media is pushing, the story of the day, you're sort of fine, and as long you can be respected and tolerated and allowed to exist in this little niche of conservative journalism. I think the problem arises when you try to drive the media cycle as we have done. And that's where I think you can get some people aren't terribly happy with that. And so I think that this is a paradigm shift. And, where I work, the Daily Caller, we've only been around for 3 years. Other outlets like Breitbart have only been around for a few years. The Free Beacon, only a couple years. So I do think that these organizations are going to, growing and adapting to the demands and to the times. But I think that what separates them from other center-right journalistic outlets is that rather than sort of accepting the mainstream media's narratives, these outlets are breaking news that on occasion dominates news cycles. And I think that there is some pushback and some resentment from some mainstream media folks. And let me get to that. Just the other day, there was this story where this parody site, the Daily Current, had a story about how Paul Krugman was in debt, and it was sort of a play on his kind of Keynesian economic philosophy that he was adapting into his personal life. This story apparently somehow got picked up by the Boston Globe or Boston.com. They didn't editorially put it in there, but they have some mechanism whereby it got posted on their site. Apparently,
it was a wire story that was they're automated, right?
I think so, yeah. Which in and of itself is a problem because their story was up for a long, long time and it was never updated or taken down. And so right. I don't think you let them off the hook because it was automated. I think that in and of itself is a potential problem. At least a journalistic issue. You're
farming out the trust of your brand to somebody else. Although I think it was Boston.com, which I guess is blurry whether it's the Globe or not, but I think technically speaking it's not the Globe. It's a separate corporate entity that is Boston.com.
Fair enough.
So I know there's some on Boston.com.
I know they're somehow related, but I don't want to misrepresent them, especially since the whole point of this is getting things right. So Boston.com. But so apparently someone from Breitbart, I believe, saw it at Boston.com. If you saw something like that at Boston.com, you would presumably believe it to be true. So basically, I've noticed this a lot of mainstream media folks on Twitter and other places who are calling out conservative outlets specifically. In the case of Krugman, Breitbart, in fact, Krugman posted a blog called something like Breitbarted or something like that. He didn't call it Boston.com. So it seems like the focus, the magnifying glass is on these conservative outlets, when in fact, a couple weeks ago, there was a journalist at the Washington Post who was duped by the Daily Current, a story about Sarah Palin. Actually, the person who was duped by this is a good writer. I used to work with her at the Daily Caller, and I actually sympathize with her because you have all these you have this pressure to write things quickly and to get things up, and you have these parody sites that look like legitimate news outlets, and the stories are written in such a way that it's not incredibly obvious until you really delve into the story that it's satire. And frankly, truth is stranger than fiction in politics nowadays. So just because it seems absurd that somebody might say something, well, there's a lot of crazy things that actually do happen. So that the Boston.com obviously fell for it. The Washington Post fell for it. Had another instance this week, Bill. Max Fisher, a writer who was writing at the Washington Post, got a story apparently wrong. He had to issue a correction. I mean, the mainstream media gets it wrong a lot, and I feel like there is this a standard being applied now to center-right outlets where they're almost being held to a higher standard. And there's so much good reporting that takes place on these outlets that really is just overshadowed. I can tell you specifically at the Daily Caller that we've had some high-profile stories that get a lot of attention and controversy, but there are a lot of little stories that don't. I mean, we broke the story about what's his name not living, the senator who didn't even live in his state anymore, who lost, I think, to Murdoch.
Lugar.
Richard Lugar. It was called Richard Lugar Doesn't Live Here Anymore. A lot of little stories, not even little, but important stories like that. We broke a story about Sarah Steelman owing $750,000 in debt to vendors. Now, Sarah Steelman, I think she was running against Aiken in the primary. She was supported by Sarah Palin. Sarah Steelman lost, and she was thought to be in contention to run for, I think it was an open seat or a special election for Congress. We broke the story. She ended up not running. This is really solid, good journalism, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. So that's sort of where I stand. I do think that it is incumbent upon us, whether you're at the Daily Caller or the New York Times, to get things right, to strive for accuracy. That credibility is incredibly important, and there's no way around that. But having said that, I feel like there is an effort to diminish some of the good work being done in these center-right outlets. And by the way, I mean, I've always thought the Daily Caller occupies a similar space to the Huffington Post. I mean, if you want to call us center-right, that's fair if you call them center-left. But really, the bottom line is reporting, getting things right, and all that.
I mean, I think, we should distinguish between situations like the Krugman bankruptcy flap, which someone runs with there's a wire outlet that did the initial screw up, and under duress, under the stress of trying to be fast, people in the conservative press and in the traditional press made the same mistake. And I think there are a number of examples you could look like that where something blows through the transom and people run with it without doing their own second look at the facts of the story, because you assume it's coming from a wire, it must be true. That kind of thing happens a lot of the time, and sometimes certain things get pushed by ideological outlets because they get excited about it, but sometimes it seems like a juicy story and they run with it. And that's a failing of just the 24/7 media culture that we live in. I think there's a difference between those types of situations, and I think the thing you mentioned with Max Fisher was he was quoting from a BBC report that later got contradicted by a UN draft report, and there was some charge that maybe he was a little slow to do the correction. He says he was on vacation, so that's just that's may just be a unique circumstance. But I think there's a difference between those types of mistakes than this Friends of Hamas deal that also got some bad attention to Breitbart, where they ran a story. Senate sources told Breitbart News exclusively that they have been informed one of the reasons why Obama's nominee for defense, Chuck Hagel, has not turned over requested documents on his source of foreign funding is that one of the names of the groups reportedly is called Friends of Hamas. And even if some Senate source whispered that in your ear, if you're a journalist, you have some responsibility to do the due diligence to say, okay, who is Friends of Hamas? And you might have to find out, wait a second, this group doesn't exist, so that can't be a good rumor. That to me is a bigger journalistic fail. I mean, they're both failings. They're different kinds of failings. One is out of the pressure for speed, which I think infects all forms of media these days. And it's not fair to blame that just on conservative media. I think a Friends of Hamas deal is a circumstance which I do find a little more prevalent in conservative media these days in its relative infancy. And for conservative media's sake, you want to not have those types of glaring errors because it infects the whole industry.
Well, I think it is very important to get things right, to exercise prudence and wisdom and caution. And even when you do everything right, there will still be mistakes. And my attitude is always, there but for the grace of God, go high. I think it's entirely possible for good people, smart people, to make mistakes, and I feel like there is now a sense that how do I put it? I saw on Twitter people attacking Breitbart for picking up this Krugman story, and they better hope that they never mess up, because I wouldn't want them to be held to that same standard. I mean, I don't think you're necessary. If I saw the New York Times write something, or a trusted outlet, and I picked it up and commented on it, and it turned out to be bogus, I don't think I'm complicit. Certainly not in the sense that they are for running it originally. It used to be that you would have, hours and hours to vet things and to check it. And certainly if you're doing original reporting, you still ought to do that. But when it's a matter of kind of like blogging where you're like copying and pasting a paragraph from another outlet, a trusted outlet, and then opining on it, I suppose, at what point have you done enough due diligence of verifying things? I just think that there is kind of a double standard and an effort to diminish the credibility of some of these outlets. And by the way, I think it's also wrong to assume that they're monolithic. I mean, they're not the same, necessarily. But I think that, they get lumped in together as if they're the same. But having said that, I think that that some of the attacks on this so-called partisan media are really systemic problems with modern-day journalism, where people are in a rush to do things, where things are automated, where there's not enough editors, not enough time. And I think that there's this larger debate that doesn't get discussed when we just sort of blame these people for being sloppy. And, there was a piece, Michael Calderone over at the Huffington Post wrote a really extensive piece on this phenomenon, center-right journalism. And, it struck me that the heroes of his story, there are some exceptions, but by and large, the heroes of his story, the people who were being kind of held up and revered, were center-right journalists who sort of know their place, who weren't trying to challenge the mainstream media and their narratives. They sort of went along with the narratives. In some cases, these were access reporters who had very good relations with the Republican leadership and good access. Whereas an outlet like the Daily Caller, wrote the RNC bondage themed nightclub story. And so I think that that this is something that's going to have to be discussed. I mean, I took some personal offense. There was the editor at the American Conservative had some very harsh words for the rest of us, out here. I used to respect that magazine, and they write some very thought-provoking stuff. And look, I try to get it right, and I work at the Daily Caller. I would challenge that guy to where have I been sloppy? Where have I gotten things wrong? I'm sure I've gotten some things wrong over the years, but it's just impugning other outlets and lumping everyone in together strikes me as problematic.
No, I mean it's not fair to accuse the Daily Caller of a sin made by Breitbart. That is not every individual media outlet, really individual reporter, needs to be held by his or her own standard. And I think to your other point, there is this larger trend on getting it first or getting it as quickly as possible, which lends itself to sloppiness. And look, that's just going to be the way of the world now. I mean, we probably can't put that toothpaste back in the tube where the internet is what it is, and people are going to have itchy trigger fingers. The least you can do is
And there's also, I mean, you made a good point about the different voices. I mean, when Andrew Sullivan was at The Atlantic and he was doing all the trig truther stuff, I mean, is it fair for that to be how we think of The Atlantic, based on Andrew Sullivan's, crusade to...
I mean, on one hand, yes, because when he was at The Atlantic, they paid his salary. They're standing by his work. But I think in reality, they all had little islands in the Atlantic. I mean, it's not fair to...
Right.
When Mark Amberder was there, I would trust Mark Amberder's reporting regardless of what Andrew Sullivan does. They're just different people, and they have different reputations, different focuses.
Right.
And it wouldn't even occur to me to blame Amberder for something that Andrew Sullivan did.
Right. And I think... Stephen Glass, we talked earlier about Stephen Glass and CPAC. I mean, he made up tons of stories for the New Republic. But their mainstream media, center-left, maybe hard-left. Does that mean that Mother Jones and the Nation never get it right? The Jason Blair scandal. Y'all without sin can cast the first stone, as H.I. McDonough said in Raising Arizona. I think, look, I think that what I'm seeing is this narrative, this meme that lumps all center-right outlets together and seeks to, especially the ones who are challenging the dominant paradigm, the mainstream media, and seeks to undermine them and discredit them. In some cases, I think that it's based on bias. In some cases, maybe there are legitimate concerns. But guess what? Jason Blair and Stephen Glass, and you can get on the list. I mean, who's the guy at Jonah Lehrer?
He was.
Where was he? The New Yorker, the New York Times, wherever Jonah Lehrer was. And so now you could say, well, those guys got fired, or they apologized. I think this is a legitimate thing. If an outlet runs something that is provably false, they ought to take action. Max Fisher finally did it at the Washington Post, posting an update or a disclaimer.
In fairness to Max Fisher, he did more of that. He wrote a whole separate post explaining what had transpired and what his thought process was, and why he eventually did what he did, which I think is, if you're going to lean forward, if you're going to, I mean, in the case of that's actually the initial post was in November, based on the BBC report, and the UN report came out in March. So I mean, there's a lag time between the two posts, and then he was on vacation while the UN report came out, and then he came back and they dealt with it. And then even then he said, look, this is a draft UN report. I wasn't that inclined to do a full retraction based on this because the report's kind of sketchy. But at least he went into detail what the thinking was, and you could look at that and draw your own conclusion. And if you're going to be basing things on other people's stuff that you're not going to verify, you don't have time to verify, if a glitch happens, the best you can do for your own credibility's sake and for the reader's enlightenment is to explain what happened.
Right. And by the way, that's something that I think Andrew Sullivan, although he maybe never recanted, he does put up, like, if you could write an email, a really compelling email calling him out, and he might post it on his site. And so there is a certain transparency there. I think that some of the problem that people have with some of these center-right outlets is the reticence to admit when they're wrong or post an update. Now, in some cases, they may not be wrong. In some cases, it may be that they're right, and the mainstream media is wrong. But if you are wrong, or if you get a fact wrong, there's really no shame in admitting that and posting an update. And so, and the other thing I will say, I think that some of the people who were upset with Breitbart, who were going after Breitbart over the Boston.com thing, they thought turnabout is fair play, because when the Washington Post made the same mistake and believed the Daily Current, some of the Breitbart people were trolling them on Twitter, mocking them, and so now that Breitbart did it, it's fair game, I suppose, in their minds.
Well, I think at the end of the day, so on one hand, yeah, I think it's fair to say in some of these cases, look, this is not unique to conservative media. This is a media problem, period, and you're holding us to an unfair standard. I mean, I think there is some truth to that. But if conservative media wants to be seen as credible writ large, I don't know if there is a deep enough culture of fact checking that has permeated through the broader field that could insulate. I mean, the thing is, when a Jason Blair thing happens at the Times has hundreds of years of quality journalism as a bulwark. So you don't blame the whole apparatus. You know that 99.9% of what the New York Times does is on the level, and you blame the individual, not the brand. I don't think conservative media is at that state yet. And perhaps if there was a more of a culture that being advocated, more patrolling, more self-correcting, more calling out other conservative media outlets when they get it wrong, and not just having a whole circle around the wagons effect, and just saying, you guys do it too, it's not fair to blame things at us. And that's really, there's times where there's merit to that, of course, but that's the only posture I don't think, and maybe it's unfair, but like ask any minority group or woman trying to break into a field where they haven't been represented well before. Everyone will always say you got to do twice as good as the other guy if you're going to get ahead. That's just that's just the unfairness of life.
No, you know what? I think that's right, Bill, and that's my challenge to my colleagues and myself. Is I think that we have to be twice as good because to overcome these expectations. And maybe not fair, but think of it. If you aim to be twice as good, you fall short, you're still very good. And it's not like you're punishing yourself by holding yourself to high standards. So why not aim for that? Why not hold yourself to really high standards?
Should we leave it on that note, sir?
I think so. I think I've said all that needs to be said on this. So another good talk. Hopefully, I was in a better mood.
I'm glad you're well rested.
Yes.
Any good? Does Palm Beach have good food?
Yes. Yeah, it's good. I highly recommend the whole. I'm a fan of the whole catalog, the whole experience.
I'm not a beach guy, but I'm a food guy. So if there's a good burger in Palm Beach, if there's a good steak, I would go.
Yeah, I don't know if it's famous, if it's a famous food town, but everything I ate was good. I had some good meals there, so I got no complaints.
All right.
Yeah.
If you got one more vacation in you, it's still Sugar Shack season. The maple's still flowing.
I know. Palm Beach just barely beat you out. I mean, it was like this close.
So there's about 2 weeks left, people. If you want to get the sap from the source, this is the time. Western Massachusetts, massmaple.org, place to be. Free product placement right there.
And I mean, I'm guessing you would make if someone were coming in from out of town, a fan of the show, you might make some time.
Oh, well, of course. Absolutely.
So that would be cool. So plan accordingly, folks. You know what we should do is a tour, like a cruise. Maybe a cruise is a bad idea after that recent incident, but the Blogging Heads cruise. There's got to be literally dozens of people who would want to cruise the high seas with us, and you and I could do this live
That's true.
in front of a live studio audience.
So it would be the whole blogging at stay. Would it be a DMZ cruise with 2 people on a giant boat or 2 people on a tugboat?
I think we need to pull in the big guns and have the entire Blogging Heads family on the cruise. That's the only way this happens.
That would be a very trying week on the high seas, I think.
Yes.
All right. Well, till next week. Always going to talk to you, Mr. Lewis.
All right, man. See you in the DMZ.
Take care.